In the dim glow of a medieval hearth, the heart of the home was never quite warm. Flames licked the edges of soot-darkened stones, casting trembling shadows that danced along the walls and ceiling. Smoke curled like a phantom's breath, filling the small rooms with a scent of wood, ash, and lingering unease. In these quiet villages, where the forest pressed close and the horizon offered only the uncertain shapes of hills and sky, fear was never far from the threshold. It began here, in the domestic space, in the hum of everyday life, in the smallest disruptions that might otherwise have been ignored. A pot overturned, spilling grain across the floor. A sudden cough in the night. A child born pale and weak, or a goat found dead in the pen. These were ordinary tragedies, the misfortunes of a fragile life tethered to the seasons. And yet, in a world that was still half wilderness, half human settlement, such events took on meanings far beyond their immediate cause. They were signs, subtle, almost imperceptible, that the world held hidden currents of intent. In the flicker of candlelight, in the shadow of the rafters, the villagers began to sense that some malevolent presence watched, waited, and whispered. It was here, around the hearth, that fear first became sacred. Not yet codified in law or ritual, not yet given a name, but already acknowledged in gestures and glances. Mothers murmured cautions to their daughters, and daughters learned that kindness could be mistaken for weakness. The hearth was both sanctuary and sentinel, a place of warmth and sustenance, yet also of vulnerability. For the hearth gathered all life, food, family, memory, and the unseen hand of misfortune seemed most intent upon what it touched. History remembers this as a time before the witch trials, before courts and inquisitions, before confession under threat of flame. Yet even in this early period, long before the official machinery of persecution was established, communities had developed their own rituals of suspicion. These rituals were subtle, woven into everyday routines, a careful watch over the neighbors, an insistence upon obedience, a whisper in the shadows about what might be lurking just beyond the eye's reach. Fear, in this sense, was not yet a tool of the state or the church. It was a living, breathing presence in the domestic sphere, quietly shaping thought and behavior. Archaeological records hint at this silent terror. Excavations of medieval homes reveal hearths carefully positioned not only for warmth but for surveillance of the interior, for the control of space. The layout of a kitchen or a sleeping chamber, the placement of the family's possessions, often betrayed an instinctive response to unseen threats. Anthropologists and historians have long noted that superstition and domestic practice were intertwined. Charms hidden in walls, herbs hung in doorways, small tokens of protection laid in corners. These were not mere curiosities of belief, but expressions of a deeply felt anxiety, a practical acknowledgement that danger was everywhere, even in the spaces meant to nurture life. The psychological dimension of this early fear is perhaps most revealing. In the whispering hearth, the mind learned to translate ambiguity into narrative. An illness was no longer random. A neighbor's envy might have sent it. A child's nightmares were not merely the product of imagination. Perhaps some invisible agent prowled the night. In the absence of scientific understanding, the human psyche constructed patterns from chaos, giving the unknown a face, a motive, a will. And so, the first seeds of witchcraft lore were sown, long before the word which carried legal weight. They were born from the mind's attempt to impose order upon a world that often seemed indifferent, capricious, and cruel. In these villages, the lines between daily life and the supernatural blurred. Cooking a meal, tending the fire, mending clothes, all were acts performed under the shadow of potential malice. A dropped knife, a burnt loaf, a sudden draft that extinguished a candle, each could be read as a sign, a small thread in a tapestry of suspicion. Elders passed down warnings in hushed tones, shaping a culture in which the ordinary was never entirely safe, and in which attention to the invisible could mean the difference between survival and disaster. Yet, despite the quiet terror, there was also wonder. The hearth was a locus of creation as much as fear. Families gathered around it not only to eat but to tell stories, to remember ancestors, to weave myth into memory. It was here that tales of spirits, of malevolent forces, and of protective charms first took hold. stories that would later swell into the grand narratives of witches and demons. The hearth was a place where the human imagination encountered the mysteries of the world, and where the faint outlines of belief were drawn in the smoke and firelight. It is important to recognize the humanity beneath this early fear. The people who whispered around the hearth were not monsters, nor were they credulous fools. They were survivors, navigating a world of scarcity, disease, and mortality. Their interpretations of misfortune were attempts to understand, to control, and to protect. In this way, the whispering hearth becomes a mirror for our own anxieties, a reminder that the impulse to seek patterns, to assign intention, and to ritualize protection is timeless, rooted in the deepest recesses of human consciousness. As centuries would pass, these domestic anxieties would evolve, magnify, and ultimately find expression in the infamous witch trials of Europe. But in this earliest stage, the fear was subtle, almost intimate, a presence that did not yet require legal sanction or ecclesiastical authority. It was sacred in its quiet power, commanding respect, shaping behavior, and quietly dictating the rhythms of everyday life. The hearth, once merely a place of warmth and sustenance, had become a crucible of human belief, of fear made tangible, of the first whispers of a world in which the unseen could hold sway. And so, when we look back across the centuries to the quiet villages of medieval Europe, we can imagine the flickering shadows on the walls, the wary eyes of mothers and daughters, and the soft, trembling voice of human anxiety speaking in the smoke and embers. Fear had no name yet, but it already lived among them, as real and potent as any physical threat. It shaped homes, relationships, and lives, quietly preparing the stage for the age of witch trials, where whispers would become law, and suspicion would be sanctified in flame. In the whispering hearth, we glimpse the profound truth of human history. That fear, when intertwined with the intimate spaces of life, becomes a force capable of shaping societies. It teaches us that before terror was codified in courts or in scrolls, it was nurtured in the most ordinary human spaces, around fires in kitchens, and beneath the roofs of homes where life and death, protection and peril, dance together in shadow and light. The hearth whispers still, across the centuries, reminding us that the roots of fear are never far from the places we hold most dear. The earth held its secrets tightly, whispering only to those who knew how to listen. In the fields surrounding medieval villages, every furrow, every patch of barren soil, was a text to be read, a message from the unseen. Crops that withered overnight, sudden infestations of insects, or the unseasonal decay of fruit were not random misfortunes. They were omens, warnings cast by forces beyond human understanding. To the villagers, the soil itself could speak of anger, envy, or malevolent intent, and they treated its messages with both awe and dread. Agriculture, so essential to survival, became an act of divination as much as labor. The turning of a plow, the scattering of seed, the care of young plants, all were measured against the uncertain signs the land provided. Farmers learned to note patterns in storms, the angles of sunlight, the texture of rain-soaked soil. But even the most meticulous observation could not shield them from the suspicion that misfortune was guided, not by chance, but by some human or supernatural hand. A ruined harvest might reflect the cruelty of neighbors, the malice of a wandering sorcerer, or the displeasure of spirits long forgotten. In these small, cultivated spaces, human anxiety took root alongside the crops. Superstition intertwined with practical knowledge, creating a landscape where every anomaly carried moral weight. It was not simply a matter of survival. It was a matter of meaning. Misfortune demanded explanation, and in the absence of scientific certainty, the imagination provided answers. Villagers came to see themselves as participants in a dialogue with the unseen, reading the soil as one reads scripture, interpreting signs with careful ritual, whispered counsel, and gestures of protection. Archaeological studies reveal traces of this interplay between fear and labor. Buried beneath fields and homesteads, we find tokens of protection, amulets hidden beneath foundations, charms placed in corners of barns, offerings left for fertility of the soil. These were tangible attempts to negotiate with the unknown, to assert some measure of control over a world that was otherwise unpredictable. In these objects, the human desire to protect, explain, and survive is etched into clay, bone, and metal. Yet beneath these acts of caution lies something deeper: the birth of narrative itself. The villagers' interpretations of the soil signs would eventually feed the lore of witchcraft, laying the foundation for suspicion, accusation, and moral panic. Here, long before formal trials, fear was sown into the land itself, turning ordinary misfortune into a story of invisible struggle and unseen hands. The soil remembered. It preserved the memory of human anxiety, and in the act of tending it, people confronted both the fragility of life and the weight of unseen forces. To walk across a field was to traverse a landscape imbued with meaning, where survival depended not only on skill and strength but on attentiveness to the subtle, almost imperceptible signs of a world that never fully revealed itself. In the quiet labor of sowing and reaping, the villagers learned to live in constant dialogue with mystery. The soil, like the hearth, became a mirror of the human mind, fertile, capricious, and alive with whispers of fear. And so, the first rituals of interpretation, protection, and reverence were born, grounded in the earth itself, and marking the slow, inexorable path toward the age when suspicion would become law. In the villages of medieval Europe, some lives moved at the edge of the hearth's light, dwelling in the margins of society, yet intimately connected to its survival. Women who healed, who delivered children, who gathered herbs from the woods, held knowledge both revered and feared. Their hands nurtured life, and yet the same hands, it was whispered, could bring death. In a world where misfortune demanded explanation, these women became both guardians and targets, the first to bear the weight of suspicion that would later swell into legend. The midwife, the herbalist, the solitary widow, each occupied a space simultaneously indispensable and precarious. They knew the properties of plants and roots, the signs of illness, the cycles of birth and death. They could ease suffering, ward off infection, or ease a child into the world, yet this knowledge carried a shadow. To understand the hidden forces of life was to court fear, an early whisper of the notion that human skill might be indistinguishable from otherworldly influence. In their hands, medicine was indistinct from magic, and care could be misread as malice. Folklore, already taking shape in the imaginations of villagers, began to center on these figures. Tales told of women who moved unseen, who could curse as easily as they could heal, who carried familiars or commanded spirits. These stories were not idle fantasy. They were reflections of a society attempting to make sense of power it could not control. Knowledge, especially the knowledge wielded by women, became a locus of both awe and terror. The hearth and the field demanded their labor, but the whispering villagers demanded explanations. And when misfortune struck, these women, at the margins of law and custom, were easiest to blame. Historical records and court documents, even from centuries before the infamous witch trials, reveal a pattern. Accusations often arose not from evidence of wrongdoing, but from envy, fear, or misunderstanding. A woman who lived alone, who spoke freely, who possessed remedies unknown to her neighbors, could be suspected of influence over illness, death, or bad luck. Anthropologists note that such suspicion was bound to social dynamics. Women who operated outside of familial or communal hierarchies threatened the fragile balance of power, and suspicion became a tool for asserting control over both behavior and knowledge. Yet even in these tales of fear, there is a deeper truth. Women at the margins carried the pulse of life itself. They understood the rhythms of the human body, the cycles of nature, and the subtle signals of the world around them. They were custodians of memory and tradition, of wisdom passed orally from generation to generation. In their isolation, they became symbols of human resilience, of knowledge maintained in the shadow of fear. The village, in turn, responded with both reverence and dread. Rituals of protection, whispered warnings, and coded gestures were directed at these women, as though the mere act of observation could contain or redirect the unseen forces at work. In this delicate tension between care and suspicion, creation and accusation, we glimpse the first stirrings of the moral imagination that would later justify persecution. To walk among these women was to encounter the interface between life and fear, knowledge and mistrust, human skill and human imagination. They stood at the boundary of ordinary life, and it is here, in these margins, that the shadow of witchcraft first began to form. And though the flames of trial would not yet touch them, the whisper of suspicion was already alive, as intimate and potent as the hearth's fire, shaping lives in ways both subtle and enduring. In the shadowed villages of medieval Europe, the sacred and the sinister were never far apart. The chapel's stone walls, heavy with incense and candlelight, stood alongside the open fields and dark forests, where the wind whispered warnings to those who dared to listen. Religion and fear were intertwined, inseparable threads in the fabric of daily life. Every prayer carried a tremor of dread, every blessing a quiet hope that unseen malice would not undo the fragile balance between life and death. The villagers did not distinguish sharply between the divine and the demonic. One often flowed into the other. A sudden illness might be the work of a cursed neighbor or a test from God. A blighted crop could signal disfavor from saints, or the shadow of a hidden hand. Ritual and superstition existed in tandem, each amplifying the other, shaping the way humans understood causality and control. In this world, to ignore the potential for unseen harm was to court disaster. And yet, to recognize it was to live under a constant, heavy tension, one that bound hearts, hearths, and communities in shared vigilance. This interplay between fear and faith is deeply rooted in history. Church edicts, while condemning superstition, simultaneously acknowledged the presence of evil in human life. Parishioners were instructed to pray, to bless, to ward off demons. Yet local customs persisted, blending with official doctrine, creating a hybrid world where sacred rites could protect against both spiritual and earthly misfortune. These were the first steps in a long process of codifying fear, not as law but as practice embedded in the rhythms of everyday existence. In such a world, morality itself became inseparable from the unseen. Good behavior, obedience to custom, and attentiveness to ritual were more than social norms. They were shields against forces beyond comprehension. Every act, no matter how mundane, could carry sacred significance. Crossing oneself at a doorway, whispering a charm under one's breath, or sprinkling salt along the threshold. These small gestures were rooted in a profound awareness that life was fragile, and that the boundary between protection and peril was thin and porous. Psychologically, this environment forged a heightened perception of threat. Humans, attuned to subtle signs and patterns, became ever watchful. Dreams and omens were interpreted as messages. Coincidence was never simple. The villagers' imagination filled the spaces between events with intention, and in doing so, transformed ordinary life into a continuous negotiation with the sacred and the sinister. Their fears were not idle. They were strategies of survival, encoded in belief, reinforced by ritual, and perpetuated by the stories passed from one generation to the next. Yet there was beauty in this fear, a solemn reverence for life's fragility. The same practices that arose from anxiety also nurtured community, memory, and continuity. The sacred, interwoven with dread, offered a framework to navigate uncertainty. In the candlelit corners of a chapel or the hushed whispers of a family at home, humans reached out to the invisible, seeking protection, understanding, and connection. The shadow of the sinister lingered in every gesture of devotion, and the sacred carried within it a quiet acknowledgement of danger. Together, they created a world in which life was precious precisely because it was precarious, and belief was both a source of comfort and a mirror of the human mind's delicate balancing act between faith and fear. In this delicate tension, the villagers lived, prayed, and survived, quietly laying the foundation for the moral imagination that centuries later would transform suspicion into law. In the quiet villages of medieval Europe, fear spoke before any law or sermon could reach the ears of the people. It was not loud nor violent. It was subtle, woven into glances, gestures, and the soft cadence of daily life. A neighbor's hesitation at the doorway, the uneasy pause of a midwife tending a newborn, the way the wind rattled shutters in the dead of night. These were all part of a language understood by those who lived close to uncertainty. The very rhythm of the village, from the turning of the plow to the hush of evening prayers, carried the echo of something unseen, an invisible presence that shaped thought as powerfully as authority itself. In this time, before codified witch trials and ecclesiastical courts, communities created their own systems of communication, subtle yet precise. Misfortune demanded explanation, and explanation required narrative. Farmers would warn one another of malevolent forces, using stories of curses and spirits to mark boundaries, both physical and social. Villagers spoke in parables, allegories, and whispered tales, passing down knowledge that functioned as both caution and instruction. These were not idle rumors nor mere superstition. They were tools of survival, a social contract encoded in the soft, deliberate tones of communal speech. The language of fear was structured, with its own grammar and rhythm. Certain words carried weight: cursed, bewitched, malefic, or familiar. Each carried meaning beyond its literal sense, signaling danger, misfortune, or moral transgression. Small accidents, illness, or unexplained deaths were immediately interpreted through this lens. In the absence of scientific explanation, human experience became the arbiter of truth. Fear was not abstract. It was lived, observed, and communicated with a precision born of necessity. Villagers learned to read signs in posture, tone, and gesture as carefully as they read the sky for rain or the soil for fertility. This communication was also performative. Social rituals, even the smallest domestic actions, were imbued with layered significance. A mother might place a protective charm above her child's cradle, not only to ward off spirits but to signal vigilance to the surrounding community. A neighbor might offer a blessing at the threshold, both to invoke divine protection and to affirm awareness of the invisible rules that governed communal life. Through these acts, fear became tangible, codified in gestures, reinforced by repetition, and perpetuated in the collective imagination. Anthropologists and historians recognize that this early language of fear was as much about social cohesion as it was about superstition. By communicating risk, threat, and moral expectation through stories and symbols, communities established boundaries, regulated behavior, and maintained a fragile sense of order in an unpredictable world. The invisible forces they feared were not always supernatural. Envy, deceit, and ambition were as much a part of the equation as spirits and curses. And yet, in framing human danger within the cosmic, the villagers endowed morality with a sacred weight. Fear and ethics became intertwined, inseparable, a quiet pedagogy of survival. There was also a poetic dimension to this language. In the telling of misfortune, the villagers transformed the mundane into myth. A sudden frost was not just frost, it was the breath of an unseen being, a warning etched into the natural world. A child's sudden illness was a tale of imbalance, both human and spiritual, demanding interpretation and ritual response. In these stories, imagination and experience met, creating a shared consciousness where the unseen could influence the seen, and where fear became a form of intimate knowledge. Yet the language of fear was not static. It evolved with each generation, growing richer and more complex. What began as whispered caution around the hearth would later give rise to accusation, interrogation, and the machinery of persecution. Every story told, every gesture performed, and every warning whispered laid the groundwork for an intricate network of belief, suspicion, and moral reasoning. It was a culture where the invisible was real, the spoken word carried weight, and life itself was measured against the quiet authority of unseen forces. In the hushed exchanges of a village evening, we glimpse a human truth that echoes across centuries. That fear, when given voice, shapes thought, behavior, and memory. It teaches, warns, and binds communities together. And in the subtle, deliberate language of the medieval village, we find the first articulations of a moral universe in which the unseen governed as surely as the seen, where caution became ritual, and where human imagination transformed everyday life into a canvas for the sacred and the sinister alike. In the dim corners of medieval villages, sickness appeared not as a biological event, but as a whisper of something unseen. A fever in a child, a sudden pallor in the face of a mother, the inexplicable death of livestock. Each became a riddle, a message from forces that humans could neither see nor fully understand. The boundary between the natural and the supernatural was porous, and misfortune was rarely dismissed as mere happenstance. In a world where science had yet to illuminate the workings of disease, every ailment was a story, every loss a portent, every shadow a possible sign of deliberate intent. The invisible forces that villagers believed shaped their lives were many and varied. They ranged from wandering spirits to familiars, from angry ancestors to malicious neighbors, and even to the subtle workings of the human mind itself. Illness and misfortune were not purely physical. They carried moral and spiritual weight. A plague that struck a household could be interpreted as punishment for hidden sin, a curse laid by a jealous neighbor, or the restless wrath of a spirit denied proper rites. Disease was never neutral. It was a conversation between humans and forces beyond comprehension, one conducted in the language of fear, ritual, and observation. Historical records reveal that even before the infamous witch trials, villagers sought explanations for the inexplicable in the people around them. Healers and wise women were consulted for remedies, not only to cure the body but to appease the unseen. Their potions, charms, and incantations were attempts to negotiate with forces both natural and supernatural. They worked in a delicate balance between compassion and caution. Their knowledge sought for relief yet feared for its potential power. And when a remedy failed or misfortune persisted, suspicion often fell upon those same hands that had once been trusted. The line between caregiver and suspect was tenuous, drawn in the soft shadows of fear. The psychological dimension of this belief is crucial. In the absence of empirical understanding, the mind became a repository for explanation. Random events were interpreted as signs, coincidences became evidence, and the human imagination filled the spaces between certainty and chaos with stories of invisible interference. To live in this state was to constantly negotiate reality, to translate the unpredictable into narrative, and to impose order on the disorder of existence. Villagers developed an acute awareness of pattern and anomaly, reading gestures, sickness, and accidents as they might read the clouds or the soil, searching for meaning, seeking control in a world that offered none easily. Communities reinforced these interpretations collectively. Tales of misfortune were shared, warnings whispered, and rituals performed. Protective charms were placed beneath thresholds, herbs hung from beams, and prayers uttered over the sick. These actions, at once practical and symbolic, were measures against forces that were as invisible as they were feared. They provided a framework for understanding a fragile existence and allowed communities to act, however tentatively, against threats they could neither see nor fully comprehend. Yet the invisibility of the threat did not make it abstract. On the contrary, it made it intimate and immediate. Illness claimed the hearth, misfortune struck the field, and fear hovered in every corner of the village. It was personal, persistent, and pervasive. This interplay between vulnerability and vigilance shaped not only the daily routines of life but the imagination of the human mind, forging narratives that blended fact and fable, the tangible and the spectral. In every unexplained death or sudden misfortune, the villagers found a story that would ripple through memory, ritual, and eventually law. The invisible, in this way, was never truly absent. It lived in every glance, every whispered suspicion, every precautionary act. It was a companion to daily life, a mirror reflecting the fragility of human existence, and a teacher of morality, caution, and survival. The earliest seeds of witchcraft accusation, subtle and unspoken, were nurtured here, in the small acts of interpretation, the careful observation of signs, and the profound desire to make sense of misfortune. In the hush of the medieval night, as villagers tended the sick and guarded the hearth, the invisible world pressed close. It was neither wholly benign nor wholly malevolent, but it demanded attention, respect, and response. Illness and misfortune became more than bodily realities. They became moral, spiritual, and social forces. And in navigating this invisible landscape, humanity learned to live in constant dialogue with uncertainty, a dialogue that would shape both imagination and law, and eventually pave the way for the grim machinery of witch trials. Long before the courtroom was convened and the law was read aloud, the human mind had already become a tribunal. In the quiet, dimly lit villages of medieval Europe, suspicion and imagination were judges, evidence was fleeting, and guilt was as often assumed as proven. thoughts, gestures, and even dreams were scrutinized with the same intensity later reserved for formal trials. The mind itself became a stage where accusation, fear, and morality collided, a subtle, relentless inquisition that shaped behavior and perception long before official authority arrived. Every misfortune, every illness, every unexplained death carried weight beyond its immediate reality. A child's sudden sickness was not merely biological. It was the manifestation of intent, of hidden malice. A failed harvest was rarely a failure of skill. It could be the consequence of envy, sorcery, or the displeasure of spirits. In this environment, the imagination was not a frivolity but a necessity, a tool of survival, and a mirror of human anxiety. Villagers interpreted the world through a lens that blurred fact and fear, merging observation with conjecture, and in so doing, constructed a moral universe in which thought and deed were inseparable. Psychologically, this early period of suspicion was intense and pervasive. The mind learned to seek patterns, to attribute meaning to coincidence, to perceive threats where none could be verified. Dreams were dissected, bodily ailments read as omens, and minor accidents remembered as proof of invisible design. Fear was encoded into thought itself, teaching vigilance in every glance, caution in every action. The interior life, private, fleeting, imagined, became as significant as the observable world, and in these private trials, the seeds of public accusation were sown. These internalized trials were often guided by social structures. Neighbors observed one another with care, passing judgment in subtle gestures. A suspicious glance, an offhand comment, the telling emphasis in a story recounted at the hearth. Knowledge, particularly that which resided with women or outsiders, was weighed heavily. Its practitioners both relied upon and feared. A healer's skill might protect a family from disease, but a failed remedy could mark her as the cause of suffering. In this way, communities regulated themselves through a shared moral imagination, mediated by observation, memory, and the constant interpretation of human behavior. Historical accounts suggest that this period created the psychological infrastructure that would later sustain the formal witch trials. Confession, coercion, and interrogation found fertile ground in minds already trained to suspect, to doubt, and to assign blame before any authority intervened. Guilt was often imagined long before it was imposed, and the moral weight of thought became indistinguishable from the weight of deed. The line between perception and reality, suspicion and proof, was subtle and mutable, yet it carried consequences as real as any punishment delivered by law. Yet there was more than dread in these trials of the mind. They were also a testament to the human struggle to impose order on chaos, to seek justice and explanation in a world filled with uncertainty. Every judgment, whether silent or whispered, was an attempt to navigate moral complexity, to anticipate danger, and to preserve community. Fear, imagination, and morality were inseparable companions, shaping not only behavior but the very stories that bound villagers together. In this delicate interior tribunal, the unseen forces of the world were translated into human terms. Villagers learned that thoughts, intention, and perception carried power. The mind could condemn, the imagination could accuse, and the memory of misfortune could reinforce moral law. In the quiet of the night, by the flickering fire or beneath the shadowed rafters of the home, the human conscience rehearsed judgments that would later be formalized in law, ritual, and flame. And so, before the courts of man were ever convened, the first trials had already begun, in the theater of thought. Here, in the invisible chambers of the mind, fear, morality, and imagination intertwined, forging the template for centuries of suspicion. The mind became both judge and witness, interpreter and storyteller, shaping lives with the quiet, inexorable authority of thought itself. In these early trials, we glimpse the profound truth of human history, that before law codifies fear, the mind itself must first confront it. In the fragile villages of medieval Europe, where misfortune lingered in every shadow and unseen forces were thought to walk among the living, rituals of protection became a lifeline. They were subtle, domestic, and often invisible to outsiders, yet their presence shaped the rhythm of daily life. Herbs hung from rafters, salt sprinkled across thresholds, and amulets hidden beneath floorboards were more than superstition. They were attempts to negotiate with the unseen, to exert control over a world that seemed to defy understanding. In the spaces between fear and survival, these small, deliberate acts became sacred gestures, both shields and statements of human resilience. The hearth remained the center of this protective landscape. Around it, families performed quiet rites with gestures refined over generations. A mother might trace the sign of the cross over a newborn, whispering a prayer as protective as it was intimate. A midwife might place a charm in the cradle to safeguard the child from spirits that moved through dreams and shadows. These rituals were not merely symbolic. They were a dialogue between human beings and the invisible currents that governed life and death. To perform them was to acknowledge fragility, to assert agency, and to cultivate hope in a precarious world. Such rituals extended beyond the domestic sphere. Fields, barns, and granaries were adorned with tokens meant to guard crops and livestock from misfortune. Offerings of bread, water, or small coins were left for spirits and ancestors alike, gestures that fused devotion with practicality. Every act of protection was a statement of awareness, a conscious effort to negotiate with forces both natural and supernatural. In this way, ritual was a language, a vocabulary of caution, reverence, and moral intention that permeated the rhythm of everyday life. Anthropologists studying these early practices note a dual function: protection and pedagogy. By embedding these acts into routine, communities reinforced social norms and ethical codes, teaching vigilance, respect, and attentiveness. The smallest gestures, from sprinkling salt to reciting a prayer, reminded villagers of their place in the cosmos and their responsibility toward one another. Fear, channeled through ritual, became a form of education, shaping behavior long before the law or the church could intervene. Rituals of protection also reveal a profound human desire for order amid chaos. In a world where illness struck without warning, crops failed without explanation, and death moved unpredictably, these gestures created a sense of agency. To hang a bundle of herbs, to bless a doorway, or to carry an amulet was to assert influence over events that were otherwise uncontrollable. It was an early negotiation with uncertainty, a practice that acknowledged both the limits and the power of human action. Yet these acts were not purely defensive. They were imaginative, even poetic. The placement of a charm beneath a beam, the careful selection of protective herbs, or the recitation of a particular prayer transformed the environment itself. The walls, the floors, the very air of the home became imbued with meaning, turning ordinary spaces into sanctuaries, every gesture a testament to human ingenuity and the enduring desire to bend fate, however subtly, to one's will. Over time, these protective rituals would lay the groundwork for more formalized beliefs in witchcraft and maleficence. Communities that once guarded against spirits would eventually guard against neighbors, and the language of protection would merge with accusation. Yet in their earliest form, these rituals were not about punishment. They were about survival, mindfulness, and the quiet assertion of human dignity in a world that offered no guarantees. In the flickering firelight of the medieval home, one can still imagine these gestures, performed with careful attention, steeped in reverence, and guided by fear. Each charm, each prayer, each sprinkle of salt is a testament to the human mind's desire to render the invisible tangible, to shape destiny through ritual, and to find comfort in the quiet acknowledgement of uncertainty. These were the first acts of deliberate protection, small bulwarks against chaos, sacred in their intent, and enduring in the human memory. And so, across the centuries, the rhythm of protection persists, whispering to us of a time when the unseen was everywhere. Fear was a constant companion, and every gesture carried both hope and meaning. In these rituals we see humanity at its most reflective, most imaginative, and most profoundly alive, a testament to the enduring power of belief in the face of uncertainty. In the flickering candlelight of medieval homes, the mirror was more than glass. It was a portal, a threshold, and sometimes a warning. Reflections did not simply show the face of the living. They revealed the hidden, the feared, and the unseen. Villagers believed that evil could linger in corners, slip through cracks, and sometimes take shape within themselves. The mind, attentive to the slightest anomaly, began to see patterns where none might exist, to interpret shadows as evidence, and to imagine malice in the faces of neighbors. In these intimate spaces, fear became a reflection of the human psyche, a mirror of anxieties, desires, and suspicion. Stories circulated of shapeshifters, spirits, and familiars, beings that blurred the line between human and supernatural. A sudden illness, a misstep in the dark, or a fleeting movement in the corner of the eye could be interpreted as the work of such entities. These narratives were not frivolous inventions. They were attempts to explain events that defied understanding, to give structure to chaos, and to articulate the invisible rules that governed life. In the village imagination, the mirror was a witness, capturing the presence of what could not otherwise be seen and reminding the living that the world was layered with meaning beyond immediate perception. The psychological resonance of these beliefs is profound. In a time before scientific reasoning could account for illness, death, or misfortune, the mind sought to assign motive, agency, and intent. Shadows became presences, accidents became signs, and reflections of the self were often interpreted as glimpses of hidden forces. Fear, intimately entwined with perception, shaped both imagination and behavior. Villagers learned to be cautious not only in action but in thought, to weigh gestures and words with care, and to navigate social life as though the unseen were ever present. Historical and folkloric evidence shows that these demons in the mirror were often projections of social and moral anxieties. Those who lived on the edges of community, the solitary, the knowledgeable, the different, were most likely to be seen as conduits of invisible power. A midwife, a widow, a herbalist, each might be suspected of influencing events through knowledge that others did not understand. The mirror, both literal and metaphorical, reflected communal fears as much as individual ones. It revealed not only what lay within the home but what lay within the collective imagination, a repository of suspicion, envy, and moral caution. These reflections became the substratum of folklore, legend, and early witchcraft accusations. They shaped the stories told at the hearth, the rituals performed to ward off evil, and the moral codes that guided behavior. The mirror taught vigilance, the shadow taught attentiveness, and the possibility of unseen influence taught the village to read the world as a continuous text, where meaning was embedded in subtle signs and small anomalies. In this way, the supernatural was inseparable from the everyday, an ever-present dialogue between human perception and the mysteries of the world. Yet there was also artistry in this fear, a poetic dimension that transformed the ordinary into the extraordinary. The reflection of a child's face in a windowpane, the flicker of a candle across polished metal, or the glimmer of moonlight on a still pool of water became symbols of vulnerability, wonder, and hidden potential. Through these images, villagers understood themselves not merely as passive actors in a capricious world, but as interpreters of a vast, layered reality. Fear and imagination merged to form a culture in which the invisible was felt, the unknown respected, and the human mind elevated to the role of storyteller and guardian. In the mirror, villagers glimpsed not only demons but the fragility and complexity of human existence itself. The unseen reflected in the glass was also the unseen within. Desire, envy, vigilance, and morality intertwined with superstition and observation. It was a reminder that perception shapes reality, that imagination can act as both shield and judge, and that fear, when carefully observed, can illuminate as much as it terrifies. And so, the demons in the mirror lived in tandem with human consciousness, shaping behavior, forging moral intuition, and preparing the village for the more formalized trials of accusation and persecution that would come centuries later. In every reflection, shadow, and imagined presence, we see the early architecture of human suspicion, a delicate, haunting interplay of mind, myth, and morality that endured long before the law gave it form. In the quiet villages of medieval Europe, a single word could carry the weight of life and death. Accusation was not merely speech. It was a force that rippled through households and fields, a contagion of fear that spread faster than any illness. Before the law codified suspicion, before judges convened and inquisitors questioned, the simple act of naming another as the source of misfortune wielded extraordinary power. It was a tool of survival, a mechanism of social regulation, and, at times, the seed of tragedy. Communities were intimate and interdependent. Everyone knew one another's strengths, weaknesses, and secrets. Yet this intimacy bred tension. Misfortune, an illness, a failed crop, a livestock death, required explanation, and humans, ever vigilant for cause, found it in the actions of others. The accusation did not arise in a vacuum. It was often whispered first in private, then murmured from door to door, until the entire village was aware. A glance, a gesture, a misunderstood word could become evidence, amplified by memory, imagination, and the collective need for order. The mechanics of accusation were subtle yet potent. Envy, resentment, and personal grievance intertwined with fear. A neighbor's sudden prosperity might provoke suspicion. A solitary woman's knowledge of herbs might appear threatening. Even the innocent could become implicated, caught in a web woven from the threads of observation, rumor, and anxiety. Communities learned that speech had consequences far beyond the individual. To name someone was to draw the invisible into form, to convert suspicion into narrative, and to assert moral authority where law had not yet reached. Anthropological studies reveal that this early power of accusation functioned as social regulation. By directing attention toward an individual, communities reinforced boundaries, enforced norms, and maintained cohesion. Yet this mechanism was double-edged. The same vigilance that preserved life and order also amplified fear, making imagination as influential as reality. In these small, intimate societies, rumor and observation were inseparable, and the act of accusation became both shield and weapon, a way to navigate uncertainty in a world where misfortune could strike indiscriminately. Accusation was also performative, a ritual in its own right. The act of naming a neighbor, of pointing to a source of misfortune, required careful timing, deliberate tone, and persuasive gesture. Each utterance carried moral weight. Each whisper was a signal, a warning, a recalibration of the community's perception of risk. Even silence could be interpreted as guilt. In this way, accusation became a language, codifying fear into action, weaving morality into observation, and shaping the communal consciousness long before courts or inquisitions imposed formal judgment. The psychological impact of accusation was profound. Being named as the cause of unseen harm was terrifying and disorienting, even when untrue. Those accused often internalized the suspicion, their thoughts shaped by the fear projected onto them. Memory and imagination collaborated to produce confession, reconciliation, or resistance, and in this interplay of perception and reality, the human mind itself became both instrument and witness. The power of accusation, in this sense, was as much about the accuser as the accused, shaping thought, behavior, and belief in equal measure. Over time, these dynamics would crystallize into formal mechanisms of persecution, where accusation became law and fear became codified punishment. But in these earliest stages, the act of naming was an intimate, almost invisible force. It shaped relationships, regulated behavior, and dictated the rhythms of village life with subtlety and precision. The power of accusation did not merely reflect human fear. It amplified it, spread it, and taught communities to negotiate uncertainty through narrative, attention, and moral judgment. In the hush of evening, when the hearth's light flickered and shadows stretched across walls, one can imagine the quiet potency of these whispered judgments. Each accusation carried weight beyond the immediate, rippling through homes, fields, and hearts. In this delicate, often invisible network of observation and narrative, we glimpse the profound truth of human history. That fear, when articulated, becomes a force capable of shaping reality itself, and that in the act of naming another, communities learned both the fragility and the resilience of social life. The power of accusation was the first law of the unseen, a quiet authority that moved through villages like a shadow. It foretold the rise of trial, of confession, and of the machinery of persecution that would later consume thousands. And in this we see a human story both timeless and intimate, that fear, when voiced, commands attention, defines morality, and shapes the very structure of human community. When suspicion moved from whispered accusation to written edict, the intangible weight of fear became tangible law. Medieval courts, often small and localized, codified what villagers had long practiced in hushed tones. The careful observation of neighbors, the interpretation of misfortune, and the moral judgment of intention. Here, fear gained structure and authority, transforming from private anxiety into a public, enforceable force. The law itself became a vessel for dread, shaping behavior not merely through punishment but by demanding constant vigilance, careful thought, and moral attentiveness from every member of the community. Before trials were ever convened, the community had already rehearsed judgment in private. Accusation had created a moral framework, and law merely formalized it. Judges and clerics acted as intermediaries between the visible and invisible, translating suspicion into procedure, rumor into testimony, and imagination into evidence. Every statute, every decree, carried echoes of the unspoken rules villagers had lived by for generations. The expectation that misfortune must have cause, that intent must be discerned, and that morality was inseparable from consequence. Law did not invent fear. It inherited it, gave it codified expression, and amplified its authority. The psychological impact of legal codification was profound. Once fear became law, the human mind learned to anticipate scrutiny. Thoughts, gestures, and even private knowledge were subject to moral evaluation. Those once merely suspected were now vulnerable to formal interrogation, and the margin for error narrowed. The subtle pressures of communal observation became reinforced by the solemnity of judicial procedure. Ritual, imagination, and morality converged in the courtroom, shaping both accuser and accused, and creating a cycle in which fear was continually validated and reinforced. Historical records reveal that this process was gradual yet relentless. Early statutes, while not yet targeting witches in the modern sense, punished maleficium, curses, and harmful magic. Communities that once relied on protective rituals now faced the authority of law if harm was perceived to have been caused intentionally. The boundaries between private caution and public enforcement blurred, and fear moved from hearth and field into parchment, ink, and official voice. Legal authority gave momentum to what had been social intuition, institutionalizing suspicion and transforming imagination into enforceable consequence. Yet law, in this early period, was not merely punitive. It also functioned as guidance, teaching communities the moral architecture of causality and consequence. Ritualized observation, careful attention to anomaly, and moral vigilance were encouraged, reinforced, and sometimes mandated. Law shaped behavior by codifying what fear had long intimated: that life was fragile, that unseen forces might influence it, and that human intention carried weight equal to natural events. In this way, statutes acted as both deterrent and pedagogy, instructing the village in morality, prudence, and the management of uncertainty. The intersection of law and fear also reveals the profound human need for order. By transforming subjective suspicion into objective procedure, communities sought to channel anxiety into structured action. Punishment became a means of control, but also a mirror of collective imagination. The act of adjudication validated concern, clarified moral expectations, and rendered the invisible world legible. In this sense, law was a vessel not only for fear but for understanding, a scaffold upon which the architecture of human morality and social order was built. In the hushed chambers of early courts, where candles flickered over parchment and stone, one can imagine fear moving like a silent presence, shaping testimony, influencing judgment, and defining morality. Law was neither neutral nor purely rational. It was inseparable from human perception, imagination, and desire for security. And in codifying fear, society learned that morality, suspicion, and authority are intertwined, that rules can carry the weight of invisible forces, and that justice is never merely procedural, but profoundly human. Thus, law became both a mirror and a magnifier, reflecting the anxieties of a village, and amplifying them into a system that could govern thought, action, and belief. Fear, once private and whispered, gained form and permanence. The vessel of law would carry it forward, shaping centuries of thought, ritual, and practice, until suspicion, imagination, and morality converged in ways that would ignite the flames of persecution. When fear became law, suspicion found its most tangible expression in fire. The first formal trials, still rare but growing, transformed abstract anxiety into spectacle. Confession, often extracted under pressure, became a ritual in its own right. A negotiation between human will and communal expectation, between imagination and authority. In this crucible, truth was less important than narrative. The flames did not merely consume the accused. They illuminated the collective psyche, revealing how deeply fear had been woven into the fabric of society, and how imagination, suspicion, and law had merged into a singular, almost sacred process. In these trials, the mind of the community became both judge and witness. Every word, gesture, and silence of the accused was scrutinized, measured against the invisible standards of misfortune, morality, and intent. Confession was more than admission of guilt. It was a performance, a statement of alignment with communal expectations. The accused often articulated not only what was expected of them, but what the community feared most. Stories of invisible familiars, curses, and secret maleficence, whispered around hearths for generations, now emerged in courtrooms, codified and amplified. The line between reality and imagination blurred, and the act of confession became a bridge between the human mind and the moral universe that suspicion had long shaped. Anthropologists and historians note that these early confessions were not always coerced through physical violence alone. The weight of social expectation, the pressure of collective attention, and the internalized lessons of fear created a psychological crucible. Individuals, long trained to interpret misfortune as evidence of hidden malice, often believed their own guilt, or felt compelled to narrate the fears projected onto them. The mind, conditioned by centuries of whispered suspicion, ritual, and observation, became a theater in which accusation and confession were enacted, a microcosm of communal morality rendered visible. Fire itself became a symbol as much as a tool. It illuminated, it purified, it terrified. The spectacle of flames against the night sky reminded all who watched that fear was real, enforceable, and morally significant. It was a warning and a lesson, a confirmation of the invisible rules that had long governed life, that human intention mattered, that unseen forces could influence reality, and that morality was inseparable from vigilance. The blaze translated abstract fear into sensory experience, shaping both imagination and behavior, and reinforcing the power of law over mind and heart alike. Yet, beneath the horror of the flames, there is a quieter human truth. Those who confessed, who endured the scrutiny of village and court, became unwitting participants in a ritual of morality, imagination, and memory. Their words, gestures, and stories preserved the accumulated anxieties of generations. Through confession, fear was codified into narrative, ritualized into law, and embedded into communal consciousness. The flames illuminated not only bodies but the intricate interplay of mind, culture, and belief that had given rise to suspicion itself. Even as we look back, centuries later, the psychological resonance is clear. The spectacle of confession teaches us about the human capacity to internalize fear, to perform morality, and to navigate the perilous intersection of imagination and reality. Every word spoken in court, every story recounted under duress, reveals the careful, often unconscious orchestration of communal belief. Fear, once whispered around the hearth, had become structured, codified, and undeniable, a force as tangible as fire itself. And yet, in the glow of the flames, we can also glimpse the resilience of the human spirit. The accused, whether guilty or innocent, became conduits of knowledge, bearers of communal anxiety, and unwitting teachers of morality, caution, and vigilance. In this crucible of fire and confession, society crystallized its fears, its imagination, and its understanding of justice. The lessons learned in these trials would echo through the centuries, shaping ritual, law, and the human imagination long before the final embers cooled. The flames consumed the body, but they preserved the shadow of fear, the architecture of suspicion, and the human impulse to make meaning of the invisible. In every confession, every whisper of guilt, and every crackle of fire, we hear the voice of a past in which morality and fear were inseparable, and imagination became law. Long after the flames had died and the courtrooms emptied, the shadows of suspicion lingered. Villages that had once whispered cautions around hearths were now haunted by memory, by the echo of fear, the weight of accusation, and the stories of those who had suffered under the invisible authority of imagination and law. These echoes were not mere historical traces. They were the fingerprints of human psychology, embedded in the ways communities interpreted misfortune, understood morality, and communicated vigilance. They remind us that fear, once cultivated, does not vanish with time, but reverberates across generations, shaping thought, behavior, and belief long after its original context has faded. In the centuries that followed, the machinery of persecution became more formalized. Accusation, ritual, law, and confession merged into an intricate system that reached its apex in the infamous witch trials. Yet even in those darker moments, the roots of these practices were evident. Before the courts, before the inquisitors, before the fire, fear had already been disciplined by social custom, refined through ritual, and internalized by the human mind. Communities had long rehearsed moral judgment and practiced vigilance. The law, the flames, and the confessions were extensions of a worldview that had taken shape quietly, invisibly, over generations. Anthropologists, historians, and psychologists alike recognize this continuity. The patterns established in the medieval village, interpreting misfortune, assigning intent, codifying suspicion, persisted, evolving in form but not in essence. Fear became an inherited language, a moral grammar that instructed the living how to act, how to observe, and how to anticipate danger, whether spiritual, social, or natural. Even when superstition waned and scientific reasoning expanded, the echoes of these practices remained embedded in culture, imagination, and communal memory. They shaped storytelling, law, and the human understanding of morality itself. The persistence of these echoes also reveals the profound intimacy of fear. It is not a force that exists only in grand trials or public spectacle. It is a companion, a subtle presence in thought, in conversation, and in memory. In every cautionary tale told to a child, every ritual quietly observed, and every moral judgment rendered in the mind or the village square, we hear the resonance of centuries of vigilance. Fear, once cultivated as a means of survival, becomes a vessel for transmitting knowledge, for teaching attentiveness, and for reminding humanity of the precariousness of life. There is also a poetic resonance to these echoes. In the hush of the modern village, in the quiet observation of nature, in stories passed down through family and culture, the patterns established in medieval Europe continue to shape perception. Shadows and reflections, misfortune and fortune, morality and vigilance, all continue to echo, reminding us that human experience is inseparable from imagination. The fires of the past may be extinguished, but the lessons they illuminated remain, guiding thought, behavior, and communal awareness. Even as we study history, we can feel the weight of these echoes. They remind us that morality is not merely codified in law, but lived in thought and ritual, that fear is not simply a reaction to danger, but a language of observation, imagination, and anticipation, and that the human mind has long been capable of transforming uncertainty into structure and vulnerability into narrative. The echoes through time are not only warnings of past cruelty, but also reflections of human ingenuity, resilience, and the subtle ways communities navigate a world they cannot fully comprehend. In the quiet corners of memory and imagination, the invisible forces of the past continue to whisper. They teach us about vigilance, about the fragility of life, about the power of story, and about the delicate interplay between observation, morality, and imagination. The legacy of medieval fear is not only the machinery of persecution, but also the profound understanding that human communities have always sought to interpret, negotiate, and survive the unseen. And so, in the faint, persistent shadows of history, we hear the echo of hearths and mirrors, of whispered accusation and ritualized protection, of flame and confession. These echoes traverse centuries, carrying with them the lessons of human observation, imagination, and morality. They remind us that the past is never truly gone, that it endures in thought, in story, and in the silent, vigilant heartbeat of human culture. The echoes through time are the final testament, that fear, when disciplined by ritual, law, and reflection, becomes both teacher and mirror, illuminating not only the world we inherited, but the world we continue to inhabit.